The room trembled with the weight of his voice. Judge Joe Brown, towering in his chair, leaned forward as if sheer volume could crush the woman across from him. His words fired like bullets, sharp, fast, meant to dominate. His face flushed crimson, veins tightening at the temple, his hand slicing through the air in a furious gesture that spoke louder than the words themselves. For decades, that thunderous presence had silenced others, cowed them into submission. But not this time. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She didn't even rush to respond. Instead, she sat still, almost serene, her hand reaching up to adjust the slender microphone before her. The gesture was deliberate, calm, as though she were tuning the stage lights before delivering her first line. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, fixed on him not with fear, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous to a man used to control, calm defiance. The contrast was stark, his fury against her composure, his storm against her silence. Viewers watching could feel the tension stretch like a wire ready to snap. Some leaned closer to their screens, waiting for her to break, to stumble, to show the intimidation that had broken others before her. Yet she gave nothing. Just that gaze, just that breath, just that patience. The shouting grew louder, his insults sharper, but Crockett's stillness made them echo differently. They no longer sounded powerful. They sounded desperate. Every second she refused to be rattled, the balance shifted, and the room seemed to realize that the very thing he believed would overpower her was, in fact, eroding him. The narrator's voice cuts through like a knife. He thought raising his voice would silence her, but he had no idea what was coming next. And in that moment, it became clear that this was not just an exchange between two people. It was a collision of eras, a test of whether the old guard's thunder could still drown out the rising voices of a new America. By the end of this exchange, the judge would not be the victor. He would be the one left in regret. The moment Joe Brown's voice cracked like thunder across the room, it was clear this confrontation was never going to be a simple clash of opinions. It was not just about one man shouting and one woman holding her ground. It was about centuries of history pressing down on that table, about the way power had always been performed and the way new generations were daring to reclaim it. The stakes were higher than a televised quarrel. They touched the very question of who gets to be heard in America and who is told to sit down and stay quiet. Judge Joe Brown was not just any man. He carried with him the aura of authority, the robe of the courtroom, the weight of decades where his word was law and his voice was final. When he shouted, it was not just the sound of a man. It was the echo of a culture that had long celebrated bluster as strength, volume as dominance, and arrogance as credibility. For years, that persona had worked. He had built a reputation on it, built an empire of fear and respect around his booming tone. And in that moment, when his anger spilled onto Jasmine Crockett, he believed it would work again. But Jasmine Crockett represented something he hadn't calculated for. She was not just an opponent across the table. She was a mirror reflecting back the insecurity hidden beneath his fury. She was a black woman in American politics, standing at the crossroads of multiple struggles: race, gender, power, and representation. To be a black woman in a political arena is to walk in with the weight of being underestimated, scrutinized, and dismissed before a word is spoken. And yet, Crockett had made her career proving that every dismissal only sharpened her resolve. Joe Brown's outburst was not unique. It was part of a pattern that many viewers recognized instantly. Across America, women in leadership, especially women of color, are interrupted more, doubted more, and attacked more viciously. Social scientists have documented it, voters have witnessed it, and the women themselves have endured it time and again. The shouting, the interruptions, the condescension, they weren't new tactics. They were ancient tools designed to enforce silence. And in that moment, Judge Brown thought he was playing the same old game. But this was not the same old arena. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And the cultural winds had shifted. Americans were tired of seeing women dismissed, tired of watching voices of dignity drowned out by bluster. The audience didn't just see one man shouting. They saw generations of arrogance clashing with the rising strength of dignity and truth. What made this clash even more electric was the timing. America was already wrestling with identity, already questioning who truly holds the microphone in the public square. Social media had become a stage where voices long ignored were now amplified. A single exchange, a single clapback, could travel faster than any courtroom ruling or political speech. This was the battlefield of narrative, and every second of that confrontation was being clipped, shared, and dissected by millions. Crockett's silence in those first moments was more than composure, it was strategy. It was a message. It said, "Your shouting does not move me. Your authority does not define me. I will answer you on my terms, not yours." And for viewers at home, especially for women who had lived through similar moments in their workplaces, classrooms, or homes, her calm became a kind of vindication. The stakes only grew clearer when commentators began framing the exchange. Some saw Brown as the relic of a time when power was measured in volume and intimidation. Others saw Crockett as the embodiment of a new American resilience, one that doesn't need to shout to be heard, one that understands the weight of words spoken with clarity. The clash between them was no accident. It was symbolic, almost cinematic, of a country divided between old models of authority and the new demand for respect. And yet, the beauty of the moment was that Crockett didn't need to explain any of this outright. Her presence, her refusal to break, said it all. Every raised eyebrow, every pause before speaking, was a message louder than Brown's shouting. "I know who I am. I know why I'm here. And I won't be diminished by noise." The narrator's voice drives the point home. This wasn't just about Crockett versus Brown. It was about power, respect, and America's soul. Viewers could feel it. The argument had transcended the room. It wasn't about who won a debate point. It was about who defined the meaning of strength in America. Would it still belong to the ones who shouted the loudest? Or had the time come for strength to be measured in something deeper, composure, clarity, and conviction? And as Brown's voice grew harsher and Crockett's silence grew sharper, it became clear that this was not just a verbal exchange. This was the stage being set for a reversal, the kind of moment that would send shockwaves across the country. The stakes had been raised, but no one watching was ready for what Jasmine Crockett was about to do next. Before the cameras captured him shouting at Jasmine Crockett, before social media turned his outburst into a cultural flashpoint, Judge Joe Brown had already carved out a reputation that was larger than life. For years, he was a household name, a fixture of afternoon television. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch him preside over televised court cases, his booming voice cutting through excuses and his stern manner demanding obedience. To many, he was a symbol of tough love, a man who claimed to uphold respect for the law and for order. His name carried a certain authority, and his word, on television and in the courtroom, was treated like final judgment. Brown's brand was never subtle. He thrived on spectacle. His gavel didn't just punctuate decisions, it echoed with the force of his personality. He lectured defendants like a schoolmaster scolding wayward children, his words sharp, his tone unforgiving. To some, this was entertainment, a satisfying display of authority at a time when the culture celebrated tough talk as authenticity. His audience tuned in for the drama as much as for the rulings, and for a while, Brown gave them exactly what they wanted. But beneath the spectacle, cracks in his image began to show. Those same mannerisms that once seemed commanding began to feel abrasive, even hostile, in a changing cultural climate. The world was evolving, and viewers started to see in his shouting not strength, but insecurity. His style, rooted in dominance, began to feel like a relic of an earlier era, a time when raising one's voice was enough to silence dissent. And as more Americans questioned outdated notions of authority, Joe Brown's brashness started to look less like toughness and more like bullying. His career highlights could not erase the controversies that trailed behind him. He prided himself on being a man of the law, yet too often his actions suggested a disregard for the dignity of those who stood before him. He claimed to respect order, but he frequently created chaos with his outbursts. He argued that he embodied fairness, but his tone often revealed contempt for anyone who dared to challenge his authority. The contradiction was glaring. How could a man who preached about respect so routinely dish out disrespect? These contradictions came to define him. On one hand, he was the judge who lectured young men about responsibility, who told defendants to act like adults and show respect. On the other, he was the same man who shouted down critics, mocked women who opposed him, and treated political adversaries with disdain. The persona that had made him famous, domineering, loud, uncompromising, was also what kept him from evolving in a world that demanded more than bluster. By the time he found himself across from Jasmine Crockett, the shift in public perception was undeniable. What once looked like wisdom now seemed like stubbornness. What once passed for authority now read as arrogance. To his supporters, he was still a man unafraid to say it like it is. To his critics, he was proof of why old models of leadership had lost their legitimacy. Yet Brown remained convinced of his own strength. He believed his voice still carried the same weight it had in the courtroom. He believed volume would still translate to power. And so, when confronted with Crockett, young, poised, sharp, and unshaken, he leaned back on the only weapon he had ever truly relied on, his booming, domineering voice. But history had shifted beneath him. America was no longer impressed by volume for volume's sake. The cultural stage had been rewritten, and Crockett's quiet composure exposed the truth. Shouting without substance was not power, it was desperation. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same tactics that had made Joe Brown a star were now unraveling him in real time. The very voice that once commanded silence now betrayed his weakness. Every raised tone, every dismissive remark, every jab that came without thought, it no longer projected confidence. It projected fear of being outmatched, fear of being irrelevant. The narrator's voice sharpens, the foreshadow heavy in the air. The same voice that once commanded a courtroom would become the voice of his undoing. And as Joe Brown's temper rose, the stage was being set for Jasmine Crockett's answer, a response that would not only shatter his composure, but redefine the meaning of strength in front of millions. Long before Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone in that heated room, long before her calm stare cut through Judge Joe Brown's shouting, her story had already been one of resilience, grit, and fire carefully tempered into discipline. To understand why she didn't flinch in that moment, you have to trace her steps back to the beginning, to the soil where her roots were planted, and the trials that shaped her into a fighter who never loses composure. Jasmine Crockett grew up in Texas, in a world that was far from gentle toward young black girls with ambition. Her childhood was marked by contradictions, love and support within her family, but a broader society that often whispered, or shouted, that her dreams were too big, too bold, too impossible. She knew early what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers doubted her. Classmates mocked her. Strangers looked past her. Every barrier was a reminder that for someone like her, success would never be handed freely. It would have to be seized. And seize it she did. Her mind sharpened in the classroom, where she refused to be defined by the low expectations of others. She pushed harder, studied longer, and demanded excellence of herself. But it wasn't just personal ambition driving her. It was the quiet, unspoken promise to her community, to her family, and to every little girl who might come after her. If she could break through, others could too. Her path led her into the law, a place where battles are fought not with fists but with words, precedent, and unshakable confidence. She became a public defender, one of the toughest jobs in the legal world. There, in courtrooms across Texas, she stood beside the accused, the marginalized, the forgotten, people the system was ready to discard. For many, she was their last line of defense. And every day in that role, she learned something crucial: to stay calm in the storm, to fight fiercely but never recklessly, and to command respect not by shouting, but by outthinking, outworking, and outlasting. As a public defender, she absorbed the raw inequities of the justice system. She saw how wealth, privilege, and race tilted the scales, and she understood on a visceral level what it meant to stand against the tide. This wasn't theory, it was lived experience. And that experience forged in her the kind of steel that no raised voice could ever shatter. But Jasmine was not content to remain within the walls of the courtroom. Her activism grew, fed by the injustices she saw daily. She marched. She organized. She spoke truth to power in community halls and on public stages. She became a voice for those whose voices had been ignored, and in doing so, she began to embody a style that would later define her political career. A firebrand, yes, but a firebrand with discipline. She never wasted words. She never let her emotions carry her beyond her purpose. She could cut an opponent down with sharp logic, but she could also lift an entire room with hope. Politics, for Crockett, was never a quest for titles or prestige. It was the natural next battlefield. She ran for office not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She understood that laws are written in chambers where voices like hers were too often absent, and she refused to let the silence continue. Her rise was not without struggle. She was doubted at every turn. Opponents dismissed her as inexperienced, too young, too fiery, too female, too black. But each attempt to box her in only fueled her determination to break free. And break free she did. With each election, each speech, each victory, she carved out space for herself where others said there was none. She became known not only for her intellect and legal acumen, but for her composure under fire. Critics could throw insults, opponents could sneer, but Crockett remained steady. She carried herself with a balance that confounded adversaries, fiery enough to inspire, calm enough to disarm, unshakable enough to endure. That balance was no accident. It had been forged through years of trial. She had been told no too many times to count. She had been underestimated so often that it became almost predictable, yet she never allowed bitterness to define her. Instead, she turned every doubt into fuel. She wore underestimation like armor, knowing it made her victories even sharper when they came. By the time she squared off against Joe Brown, she had already faced storms fiercer than his shouting. She had stood in courtrooms where lives hung in the balance, where mistakes could mean prison, where the pressure was suffocating. She had battled skeptics who dismissed her candidacy, faced media scrutiny that dissected her every move, and carried the heavy mantle of representing not only herself, but an entire community of people who saw in her their own hopes. Her calm in that heated moment was not detachment, it was power. It was the power of someone who knows exactly who she is and refuses to let another person define her. Her stare was not just directed at Joe Brown. It was directed at every voice that had ever tried to diminish her, every system that had ever tried to erase her, every assumption that had ever suggested she was less. That's why millions watching felt more than just admiration. They felt recognition. For women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, for Black professionals who had been dismissed in meetings, for young activists who had been told to wait their turn, Crockett's composure was a mirror. They saw themselves in her. They saw dignity held like a shield. And they saw a living reminder that silence in the face of arrogance is not weakness, it is strategy. The narrator's voice swells. She had spent her life preparing for this kind of moment, even if she didn't know it yet. And as she leaned into that microphone, her life's journey converged on a single point. Every struggle, every insult, every underestimated moment had been practice. Now, across from the booming voice of a man who thought volume equaled power, Jasmine Crockett was about to prove that true power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from knowing exactly when and how to speak. The clash was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding, raw and unfiltered, before the audience's eyes. Judge Joe Brown, shoulders squared and jaw tight, leaned forward with the same force that once commanded silence in his courtroom. His voice cracked through the air like a gavel smashing against wood. Each interruption came sharp, intentional, designed to fracture the rhythm of his opponent. He accused. He mocked. He demanded. His words tangled together into a storm that left no room for nuance, no space for respect. But Jasmine Crockett did not rush to meet him in the chaos. She sat in stillness, hands folded lightly before her, allowing the tidal wave of noise to crash and recede. To some watching, it felt dangerous, like silence in the middle of a battlefield. Brown's strategy depended on breaking her rhythm, but there was nothing to break. Her restraint became its own counterattack, each pause unsettling, each calm glance infuriating him further. "Answer the question," Brown barked, his voice vibrating with the old confidence of a man used to unquestioned authority. "Don't dance around it. People need straight talk, not lawyer tricks." His hand slammed against the table, the microphone amplifying the thud. But Crockett, unshaken, tilted her head slightly. She let the silence breathe, let the audience feel the imbalance in the room. Her voice, when it finally came, was smooth, deliberate. "Judge Brown," she said evenly. "The difference between questioning someone and steamrolling them is respect. And you seem to be fresh out of it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision, the kind of precision that cut sharper than volume ever could. Brown erupted again, waving his hands, pointing, accusing her of playing victim, accusing her of twisting words, accusing her of being too young, too inexperienced, too everything. His voice climbed higher, but each ascent seemed to reveal not power, but fragility. He was fighting to prove control he no longer truly possessed. Meanwhile, Crockett's responses landed like carefully timed chess moves. She didn't counter every insult. She let many pass, a tactic that disarmed his fury. And when she did respond, her words struck like a hammer against brittle glass. The audience could feel it. She was waiting, timing her strike. Every measured pause, every calm adjustment of her mic, every glance that lingered just long enough, it all signaled a build, a crescendo not yet played. And then, with the room holding its breath, Crockett leaned into the mic. The shouting had reached its fever pitch. Judge Joe Brown's voice, once a booming instrument of authority, was now ragged, uneven, almost desperate. His hands moved wildly, his face flushed crimson, his words a torrent of half-finished accusations that tripped over one another. He was fighting not just Jasmine Crockett, but the very silence that seemed to absorb his fury and give nothing back. And then, finally, Crockett moved. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the base of her microphone. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, the kind of focus a surgeon wears before a critical incision. The room hushed, as if instinctively aware that something was about to break. "Judge Brown," she began, her tone calm yet piercing, "I've heard this voice before." A ripple moved through the audience. She paused, letting the weight of her words linger in the air, allowing everyone to lean forward, waiting. This is the same voice that shouts women down in boardrooms, that interrupts them in classrooms, that dismisses them in courtrooms. It's the voice of entitlement, not wisdom. Gasps. The tension shifted in an instant. What had moments earlier been Brown's stage was now hers. She didn't rush. Each phrase came in deliberate beats, like the thud of a drum in a slow march. "You can raise your voice all you want. You can wave your hands. You can try to rattle me. But you don't scare me. You don't silence me. And you certainly don't define me." A murmur of approval swelled from the audience, soft at first, then louder, as heads nodded and whispers turned to cheers. Brown tried to interject, slamming the table again. "That's not what I—" But Crockett was ready. Her eyes snapped toward him, steady and unflinching. "You've spent your career confusing volume with authority," she shot back, her tone sharpening. "But authority isn't about shouting people down, it's about listening. It's about respect. And right now, you've shown none." Laughter broke through the crowd, sharp and undeniable, not cruel but liberating. It was the laughter of recognition, the laughter of a truth spoken out loud in a space where it could not be ignored. Brown's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he scrambled to recover. He leaned forward, fumbling for words, but the rhythm was gone. His confidence, so overwhelming at the start, now seemed brittle, even pitiful. Crockett pressed the advantage. She didn't have to raise her voice. The room had already tuned him out. All ears were on her. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her tone swelling now with conviction. "This is about every woman who's ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Every black woman who's ever had to work twice as hard, speak twice as clearly, just to be heard once. You can try to shout me down, Judge, but you're only proving my point." The room erupted. Applause thundered. Cheers filled the air. Some even rose to their feet. What had been a hostile showdown only minutes earlier was now a celebration of her resilience. Brown flailed, his voice cracking as he tried to laugh it off, to pivot, to regain control. But the optics were undeniable. He looked small, his once commanding gestures now desperate, his words tripping over her poise. Crockett leaned back slightly, a faint, confident smile crossing her lips. She let the roar of the audience wash over her, not needing to add anything more. She had landed her strike. And yet, she gave one final line, measured, deliberate, unforgettable. You thought raising your voice would silence me. Instead, it just showed everyone how loud insecurity sounds. The crowd gasped again, then broke into raucous applause, laughter, cheers, even shouts of agreement. Phones lit up as people scrambled to record, to capture the moment, to make it eternal. Brown sat frozen, lips parted but no words coming, the weight of his faltering composure crushing him. He tried once more to interject, "That's not fair," but the audience drowned him out. His voice was no longer the dominant sound in the room. Jasmine Crockett had flipped the script. She had turned his aggression into his weakness, his volume into his downfall. The debate was no longer about substance. It was about symbolism, about who stood taller when the storm hit. And there was no question. The cameras zoomed in, catching the exact instant Brown slumped back, shoulders heavy, his bluster gone. Beside him, Crockett remained upright, steady, her expression calm but victorious. The scene froze, not literally, but in memory, the kind of moment destined to echo far beyond the walls of that room. And that was when social media took over. The debate might have ended in the room, but the real battle was just beginning online. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop clapback, phones buzzed across the country. Clips shot up on Twitter, now X, spreading with a speed that left even seasoned political watchers stunned. By midnight, they weren't just trending nationally, they were dominating the global charts. One particular clip, Crockett leaning forward, eyes locked, and saying, "This is what insecurity sounds like," became the crown jewel of the internet storm. Memes flooded in, each one sharper than the last. Someone spliced Brown's furious shouting into a remix with a hip-hop beat, titling it, "Volume is not equal to authority." Another user overlaid Crockett's calm smile with the caption, "Unbothered, untouchable, unmatched." On TikTok, the numbers skyrocketed. The clip racked up millions of views within hours, stitched and duet by creators who used it as a rallying cry. Young women posted their own stories of being talked over in classrooms, captioned with Crockett's words, "You don't silence me. You don't define me." Others turned her final line into motivational audio, set against workout videos, graduation celebrations, and workplace wins. Crockett had inadvertently become a soundtrack for empowerment. Instagram Reels amplified the aesthetic. Influencers and celebrities reposted the footage with fire emojis, clapping hands, and quotes. One fashion blogger wrote, "Forget the runway. This is how you serve presence." Activists shared the clip alongside civil rights speeches, drawing a lineage of resistance and resilience. Mainstream figures quickly joined the chorus. Comedian Leslie Jones tweeted, "Judge Brown got cooked and served. Somebody bring water for the man." Author Roxane Gay declared, "Crockett didn't just win. She reframed the whole power dynamic." Even voters from unexpected corners chimed in. A Republican strategist admitted on cable news, "Look, I don't agree with her politics, but that was surgical." That's the kind of composure anyone in leadership should study. For Crockett's supporters, it wasn't just entertainment, it was validation. The moment crystallized something larger. The exhaustion with voices that shout but don't listen, with authority figures who confuse bluster for wisdom. She had flipped a cultural switch, and the numbers reflected it. Polling groups reported a spike in online engagement for Crockett within 24 hours. Donations to her campaign flooded in, small dollar contributions accompanied by notes like, "For every time I was told to shut up," and "Keep speaking for us." But the most striking impact wasn't political, it was cultural. Students quoted her lines in classrooms. Office workers printed her words and taped them above desks. A high school debate team in Atlanta renamed their group chat Unbothered Authority. The resonance was everywhere, stretching far beyond partisan lines. Because this wasn't just a debate, it was a cultural earthquake. Crockett's performance cracked open a conversation about gender, race, and authority in America. It challenged the idea that leadership had to be loud, that respect had to be demanded instead of earned. And for millions watching, it was proof that resilience could be just as powerful, if not more, than rage. Judge Brown, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. His outbursts were replayed not as moments of strength, but as memes of fragility. Clips of him shouting were cut with captions like, "When you realize she's right and you can't handle it," or volume levels, Brown 100, respect 0. In trying to dominate, he had diminished himself. By week's end, Crockett wasn't just a trending topic. She was a cultural figurehead. Think pieces rolled out across major publications, asking whether this moment marked a shift in political debate, whether a new archetype of leadership was emerging. And for those who had been in the room that night, they knew the shockwaves weren't stopping anytime soon. The roar of the crowd had long faded, but the memory of that moment lingered like an echo in the nation's conscience. Jasmine Crockett did not walk away from that debate as just another politician holding her ground. She emerged as a symbol. The shouting, the interruptions, the red-faced fury hurled her way. It could have broken someone else. But she chose composure over chaos, clarity over noise, conviction over bluster. And in that choice, she revealed a truth too many forget. In America, dignity itself is a weapon. She could have matched Joe Brown's volume. She could have thrown back the same kind of fury, meeting fire with fire. But Crockett knew that wasn't the way battles for justice are won. Power doesn't always come from who can shout the loudest. Power, real power, comes from restraint, from knowing that when the storm is raging, the calm voice at the center carries the furthest. Her reflections afterward weren't about personal victory. They were about something larger, about women who are told their voices don't matter, about Black women who face double standards, about every person who has been underestimated because they didn't conform to someone else's idea of authority. Crockett spoke of dignity as armor, of persistence as defiance. And she reminded America that silence is never the same as weakness. When the clips went viral, people didn't just share them because they enjoyed a dramatic takedown. They shared them because they recognized themselves in her moment. Viewers who had been shouted down in classrooms, meetings, or even their own families saw in her a reflection of their own quiet strength. It wasn't only Crockett's words that struck a chord, it was her poise. She carried centuries of resilience in her stillness, and when she finally spoke, it was as if generations had found their voice through hers. The moral lesson was not abstract. It was urgent, tangible, alive. Shouting doesn't equal strength. Anger doesn't equal authority. True power is when your presence alone unsettles those who try to dominate you. True power is when your truth slices sharper than any insult. True power is knowing that dignity, once displayed, cannot be taken away. This moment reframed politics for many who watched. It wasn't about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. It was about what kind of America we want to be. Do we reward volume, or do we reward vision? Do we value intimidation, or do we value integrity? Crockett's clapback was more than a personal defense. It was a challenge to a culture that often mistakes aggression for leadership. And here lies the inspiration. For every young woman watching, for every immigrant who has been told to keep their head down, for every worker silenced in a meeting, Crockett's stand was a reminder. Your calm does not make you small. Your dignity does not make you invisible. It makes you unshakable. The world may try to talk over you, but when you choose the moment, when you lean into the mic, the room will stop. The noise will fall silent, and your voice will echo. Crockett herself summed it up afterward in a way that has already entered the language of resilience. The fight isn't always won by the loudest, but by the one who refuses to be silenced. That line, repeated in interviews, reposted across timelines, etched itself into the hearts of millions. It was no longer just her story. It had become a universal rallying cry. By the end, Joe Brown was remembered less for his outburst and more for the way it collapsed under the weight of Crockett's calm. His shouting faded into the background, but her words, her controlled, unshaken response, became immortalized. And that is the ultimate reversal. The one who believed that volume guaranteed victory left with regret, while the one who held steady walked away with history at her side. So the lesson stands: clear and undeniable. In America and in life, strength is not the storm. It is the stillness that survives it. Dignity is not a weakness. It is the crown that cannot be snatched. And the truth, spoken with conviction, will always outlast the shout. Because in the end, Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She reminded a nation of something timeless. When you stand in your truth, no voice, no matter how loud, can drown you out. Judge Joe Brown shouted, but it was Jasmine Crockett's clapback that echoed across the nation. His fury may have filled the room for a moment, but her words filled the hearts of millions long after the cameras stopped rolling. That's the difference between arrogance and dignity. One fades in regret, the other rises into legacy. The moral is clear. Shouting may rattle walls, but it cannot shake truth. Arrogance may puff itself up, but it always crumbles under the weight of clarity. Dignity, steady, unflinching, grounded, endures. Crockett showed that real power isn't in the noise. It's in the composure that silences the noise. She proved that conviction can outlast chaos, and that resilience will always outshine rage. This was never just about one debate stage. It was about the kind of voices America needs right now. Voices that don't bow to intimidation. Voices that stand tall even when shouted down. Voices that remind us that democracy itself depends on dignity. Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just political. It was cultural, it was moral, it was universal. And here's where you come in. If you believe voices like Jasmine's deserve to be heard louder than the shouts of arrogance, then don't let this story stop here. Share it. Amplify it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the voices shaping the battles of our time. Be part of the movement that refuses to confuse volume with vision and anger with authority. Because when history looks back, it won't remember the man who shouted. It will remember the woman who stood her ground and the people who stood with her.